What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be talking about those top 36 wide receivers as we head into week 12 of the fantasy football season. Unfortunately, right now, we're not going to have Jamar Chase. He's on suspension. A couple guys hurt like Drake London, some bye weeks to Jalen Waddle and some of these other players. So we're going to navigate through those rankings, hopefully to help you guys win your matchups here in week 12. But without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these wide receivers. All right, so as you can see, I got the tiers pulled up here on the screen. We got 7 tiers to get through all 36 wide receivers in today's video. As always, the labels on the left, or the labels of the tiers, is how I'm going to be viewing these players if we're plugging them into our lineup. So the guys at the top, those are the elite wide receiver ones here in week 12, and the guys at the bottom are more so those low-end wide receiver threes. But let's kick it off in the first tier for me. I do have a total of 4 players. It is going to be Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jaxon Smith-Njigba, Puka Nacua, and Rashee Rice as the elite wide receiver ones. As always, we're going to focus on matchups. We're going to talk about points above or below expectation, and that's just basically how many fantasy points these defenses are giving up, either above or below the projected fantasy points in which you see each week in your lineups. So it's pretty simple. It's a nice metric to use, I think, when it comes to projecting matchups and how likely it is for players to have spike weeks or maybe bad weeks. And in this tier, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown, who does have a good matchup against the New York Giants. Right now, they're giving up 2.8 fantasy points above the expectation, which is ranked 25th in the NFL. So should be a good opportunity for him to have a pretty good day here this week. Same thing can be said here for Rashee Rice. He gets the Indianapolis Colts, who are 4.7 fantasy points above the expectation on average, and that's 29th in the NFL. So should be a good opportunity for Rashee Rice as well. Obviously, after the Chiefs had a little bit of a down week last week as well. Now I'm going to move on to my tier 2. My tier 2 is going to be those high-end wide receiver ones. I got a total of 5 players in this tier, but really only one matchup I think to note. This tier has CeeDee Lamb, Stefon Diggs, Nico Collins, Davante Adams, and Emeka Egbuka. So that does round out my top 9 wide receivers here in this week's slate. I do have CeeDee Lamb as the player to talk about. He does get a bad matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles this week, and they're currently ranked 4th best against the wide receiver position, giving 4.2 fantasy points below the expectation. So a little bit of a tougher matchup here for Lamb, a little bit of a tougher matchup. Obviously, that's going to trickle down to a guy like George Pickens, but I think Lamb, still an elite wide receiver. I'm not going to bench him. We're going to start the stud still. He's a top 5 player for me despite a tough matchup, but maybe just temper the expectations a tiny bit here this week because it is going to be a little bit of a tougher matchup for CeeDee Lamb and the Dallas Cowboys wide receivers. So let's move on to tier 3. Tier 3 is going to be those low-end wide receiver ones for me. I got 4 guys to round out the rest of these guys. It's going to be Justin Jefferson at 10, T. Higgins at 11, DeVonta Smith at 12, and then I also have Chris Olave at 13. So these are kind of the low-end wide receiver ones. I know technically 12 is the cutoff line, but I have 13 because I think Olave should be in this tier as well. 2 matchups to talk about in this tier. T. Higgins gets a really good matchup on the road against the New England Patriots. They're ranked 2nd to last right now against the wide receiver position, giving up 5.5 fantasy points above the expectation. It's unfortunate because this is the matchup where Jamar Chase could have feasted, I think, but because he's not going to be in the lineup, T. Higgins, to me, he's a top 12 play, a wide receiver 1, and somebody I'm definitely trying to get into my lineup. The same thing can be said for DeVonta Smith. We have been talking about for weeks on end, target the Dallas Cowboys secondary if you have wide receivers in fantasy football. This week, it's going to be DeVonta Smith and A.J. Brown. Right now, the Cowboys are giving up 10 fantasy points above the expectation. It's dead last in the NFL by a mile. I think DeVonta Smith is in store for a big day. Maybe A.J. Brown also gets a big day. This is one of those matchups where we've heard a little bit of DeVonta Smith and definitely a lot of A.J. Brown being upset with the passing volume in this offense and some of the targets that have been coming their way. If you're going to get right, it's going to be against Dallas, and this is the ultimate get-right game here for the Philadelphia Eagles. Moving on to tier 4, these are going to be my high-end wide receiver 2s. I got 4 players just to consist of the high-end guys. It's going to be Tetairoa, McMillan, A.J. Brown. I got Zay Flowers here as well, and Wan'Dale Robinson sneaking into this tier. Again, there's really only one matchup to talk about here. It is the A.J. Brown one. Like I said with DeVonta Smith, get right game, target the Dallas secondary. These things are going to apply for A.J. Brown as well. I just think over the last couple of weeks, I'm feeling more confident in DeVonta Smith having big games than I am A.J. Brown. For whatever reason, it feels like DeVonta's on the receiving end of the big plays. It feels like he's also getting a little little bit more of the consistent work in the short yardage situations. So yeah, that's kind of everything you can ask for. AJ Brown, he's another player though that I think has the opportunity to get right now. We'll see what happens against Dallas. If AJ doesn't get right against Dallas, I don't know what to tell you, because this is the matchup to exploit. So we'll see what happens this week. But AJ Brown's still a top 15 wide receiver for me, somebody I'm looking at as a high-end wide receiver too, and still trying to get him into my lineup. I'm going to move on to my tier 5 here. Tier 5 is going to be the low-end wide receiver 2s. I got a ton of wide receivers in this tier. It goes from wide receiver 18 to 24. So we're going to kick it off with Jameson Williams, followed by Rome Odunze, George Pickens, Michael Wilson, Michael Pittman Jr., Juwan Jennings, and DK Metcalf to round out the rest of this tier. This tier is filled with matchups to talk about. I got a good matchup for Jameson Williams. We talked about it for Amon-Ra St. Brown. This is the New York Giants, 25th, giving up 2.8 fantasy points above the expectation. Should apply to Jameson Williams as well. Rome Odunze gets a good matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Right now, they're ranked 30th against the wide receiver position, giving up 5.2 fantasy points above the expectation. So should be a good opportunity for Rome Odunze to kind of get back on track after a couple slow weeks here. But this matchup against Pittsburgh is going to be a good one. George Pickens, I talked about CeeDee Lamb, so I don't want to talk about in detail too much about Pickens. Pickens looked good last week. It was a good matchup on paper for them. This one's tougher. Still think George Pickens is worthy of getting into your lineup, but I'm not expecting that big, wide receiver 1 type of week. We had him as my wide receiver 9, I think, last week in the rankings. This week, he's 20. He's just a little bit more boom bust for me, but I love George Pickens as a player. This matchup's just tougher. I do think that Michael Pittman Jr. is somebody worth talking about. He gets a bad matchup on the road against the Kansas City Chiefs. Right now, they are the 3rd best against the wide receiver position, allowing 4.3 fantasy points below the expectation. So could be a little bit tougher sledding for the Colts wide receivers this week. Maybe Michael Pittman Jr. in general, just because he's the number 1. Maybe the Kansas City defense starts to hone in on him just a little bit more. Juwan Jennings also gets a bad matchup on Monday Night Football. It's going to be against the Carolina Panthers. Right now, they're ranked top 8 against the wide receiver position, allowing 3.1 fantasy points below the expectation. So should be tougher for Juwan Jennings in this one as well. Still a wide receiver 2 play for me though. And DK Metcalf, he gets a good matchup on the road at Chicago. 4.7 fantasy points above the expectation is what they're averaging, which is 28th in the NFL. I do have DK Metcalf here right now just because Aaron Rodgers is uncertain to play going into the week. Now, if Aaron Rodgers plays, I think DK Metcalf is going to move up the ranks. He quite honestly could be towards the top of this low-end wide receiver 2 tier, all the way up to like 18. Maybe he even sneaks into the high-end wide receiver 2 tier with Wan'Dale Robinson and Zay Flowers and those guys. But at the end of the day, if it's Mason Rudolph, I'm going to be tempering the expectations even if the matchup is good, because Mason Rudolph is just not that good of a quarterback. So this is more of the Mason Rudolph effect, the uncertainty of the quarterback position for his ranking here at 24. But keep tuned in throughout the rest of the week, because if we get some good Aaron Rodgers news in those injury reports throughout the week, DK Metcalf will be somebody who's rising up the ranks as we get some more clarity. Let's go to tier 6. Tier 6 for me is going to be those high-end wide receiver 3s. I got a total of 5 players in this tier, and all of them have matchups to talk about as well. It's going to be Khalil Shakir, Romeo Doubs, Xavier Worthy, Ricky Pearsall, and DJ Moore for this tier. Khalil Shakir is a player who's going into the week questionable. He plays on Thursday Night Football. He gets the Houston Texans. This game is on the road. Houston has been top 2 against the wide receiver position, allowing 5.3 fantasy points below the expectation. This is a tougher matchup for Khalil Shakir on a short week with an injury. I'm not really going to have high expectations with him. More of a high-end wide receiver 3 play for me here this week. Now, Romeo Doubs gets to play against the Minnesota Vikings. Right now, the Minnesota Vikings are top 6 against the wide receiver position, allowing 3.2 fantasy points below the expectations. So should be tougher for Doubs. That's going to trickle down to guys like Christian Watson, maybe guys like Matthew Golden, the rest of the guys as well. So that's something to take note for the Green Bay Packers. Jordan Love has also been a little bit inconsistent over the last couple of weeks as well. We talked about a nice matchup for Rashee Rice. This is going to apply to Xavier Worthy against the Indianapolis Colts, who are currently ranked 29th, giving up 4.7 fantasy points above the expectation. But we know that Rice is the target hog. Xavier Worthy is now more of a boom bust, big play type of guy. Ricky Pearsall, he gets a bad matchup, just like we said with Juwan Jennings against the Carolina Panthers on Monday Night Football. Didn't look good last week. Obviously, first game back from injury, probably going to work his way back into the lineup in a full rotation over the next couple of weeks. I do have him here as a high-end wide receiver 3, still tempering the expectations though, because he's still recovering from injury and he's still a player that has a bad matchup on paper this week. DJ Moore is the other player in this tier we should talk about. Just like I said with Rome Odunze, the reason why we like Rome Odunze's matchup this week is because Pittsburgh is ranked 30th against the wide receiver position, giving up 5.2 fantasy points above the expectation. So if you're looking for a matchup to target, maybe you're looking for a flex play, DJ Moore I still think has some flex play appeal in this positive matchup against the Steelers. And now moving on to my last and final tier, we have the low-end wide receiver 3s. I got a total of, I think, 7 players in this tier to get through everybody. We're going to kick it off with Alec Pierce at 30. 31 Christian Watson, 32 Jordan Addison, 33 Darnell Mooney, 34 Jacoby Myers, 35 Trey Tucker, and last but not least, Tez Johnson here at 36. 3 matchups to talk about. All of them are bad matchups on paper. Alec Pierce, the same thing we said with Michael Pittman Jr., it applies to Alec Pierce. Alec Pierce, to me, is the second wide receiver that you probably want to be plugging into your lineup from the Colts from a fantasy perspective over Josh Downs these days. It just feels like Alec Pierce has more high upside each week, big play potential, obviously a red zone threat. Alec Pierce, to me, a low-end wide receiver 3 in a bad matchup, but obviously he's a big play type of guy. The same thing can apply to Christian Watson, big play guy, boom bust type of wide receiver, tougher matchup as well. Like I said with Romeo Doubs, it applies here to Christian Watson. And then we have Darnell Mooney, who I think is a really good talking point right now. I have him as my wide receiver 33. It's a bad matchup for him on paper against the New Orleans Saints, who are currently ranked 7th against the wide receiver position, allowing 3.1 fantasy points below the expectation. Obviously, Darnell Mooney elevated to wide receiver 1 with London dealing with a knee injury this week. It is going to be interesting to see how many weeks Drake London misses, if it's going to be 1, 2, 3 weeks maybe potentially. And we also have the backup quarterback play of Kirk Cousins now with Darnell Mooney. The last time Mooney was the wide receiver 1 and Kirk Cousins was the quarterback, it was not good for fantasy football. This is a tough matchup. I know a lot of people are going to be excited to throw Mooney into the lineup. I would be having a little bit of pause here. I'm not as confident that Mooney and Cousins are going to be able to get it going against the Saints here. And this is probably profiling as a better matchup for guys like Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier. Maybe a little bit better of a matchup for a guy like Kyle Pitts than it is the wide receiver position. So that is the last guy that I really want to talk about here. Just a tougher matchup for Mooney despite the added opportunity. And, you know, we get some backup quarterback play, which these days it's kind of tough to tell you how good Kirk Cousins is going to play. He's been inconsistent. It hasn't looked that great ever since he got to Atlanta. So we'll see what happens. Definitely somebody we talked about on the waiver wire episode to pick up if you need a QB this week to stream, but it's not looking like the greatest matchup overall for Darnell Mooney. But all right, there you have it. That is my top 36 wide receivers as we head into week 12 of the fantasy football season. As always, if you found something today informative, entertaining, and or actionable, do me the favor and hit that like button. Also, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel. You don't want to miss any future content. And last but not least, make sure you go join our free Discord. We do have a free Discord linked in the description, helping you guys with those fantasy football teams 24/7, 365. But with all of that being said, I have nothing else for you guys today, so I will see you on our next episode. But until then, peace out.